Welcome to our Black History Month celebration. And I am the new director of the Department of Human Rights and Equal Economic Opportunity. I've been on my job for a little over 30 days, so I'm a veteran. I have the pleasure of being able to introduce our speaker who the information she's going to provide is something that's very near and dear to my heart. So I am born and raised in Minnesota. I was actually born in St. Paul in Ramsey County Hospital. And my mother's family, I was actually put up for adoption at birth and adopted by an amazing family who hails from North Minneapolis. And the first home that I bought in North Minneapolis still had the racial covenant in the actual original title. So my great aunt on my mother's side is Nellie Stone Johnson. And so very well aware of the North Side. My mom graduated from North High School. My family predominantly on my mom's side still lives in North Minneapolis. My biological family, I found out, is all born and raised in St. Paul. And also dealt with racial covenants, etc. I teach a course on race in the law at Mitchell Hamlin's School of Law, and every year one of my students writes on housing covenants, racism. It's a course where we look at the development of race under the Constitution from the beginning of the country through all the way through present day. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm a recovering attorney. I haven't practiced for quite some time, but I'm truly honored to be here. I do have to mention on behalf of the Department of Public Works that this is a zero waste event. And what that means is that all of the plates, forks, glasses that you're drinking out of are compostable. So there are 2 bins, so if you have to leave early or you are leaving even at the same time, please make sure that you recycle, because we really want to be acknowledge the need for recycling and protection of our environment. With no further ado, I have the honor of introducing Kirsten Delegard. Kirsten is one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project, a third-generation oh my God. Sorry. I have never even seen that word. A third-generation Minneapolitan. She trained originally as a women's historian and explored the history of women in politics in her early research. More recently, she has devoted her energy to public history and unearthing the complex past of her hometown. This focus led to Mapping Prejudice and the Historiopolis Project, which Delegard also founded. She has a PhD in history from Duke University, MA in history from Duke University, and a BA from Wesleyan University College of Social Studies. She has numerous awards and has been able to do her work through Legacy Research Fellowship, many different types of fellowships, and we are honored to have her here to share with us her research.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Is the right volume? Well, I know it's, this is one of our first entrees into St. Paul, but I didn't realize that Minneapolitan would be such a difficult word. We deal with a lot of things that are hard in these presentations, but thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm glad I'm not the only Minneapolitan up here, right? So I'm a third generation Minneapolitan, which means that my grandparents started settling in the city in the 1920s, and my family has never left. But like a lot of young Minnesotans, I did leave as soon as I could when I was 18, and I said I was never coming back. My parents, to their credit, didn't say anything to that, but I did come back. And when I did, I decided that I wanted to explore the history of my hometown. What became obvious on my return is that there was this profound civic dissonance. That's the way I think about it, and that there was some things that I wanted to explore because of what I had been taught as a kid growing up in the City of Lakes. So I came of age in the 1970s. Many of you, maybe, I don't know if this is a generational thing. Those were the years when Mary Tyler Moore was walking down Nicollet Mall on national television every week, throwing your hat up in the air. And in those years, I would say that residents, I certainly was raised on this sense of civic virtue that people drew from some of our more prominent politicians. So in 1948, Hubert Humphrey, who had been the mayor of Minneapolis and went on to be a senator, of course, from Minnesota before he was vice president, he made his mark on the national political scene by going to the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia and calling on the delegates there to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. 20 years later, Walter Mondale authored the Fair Housing Act, which is one of the most significant pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress, right? And I think those achievements gave the Minnesotans a sense of civic, sort of a moral triumph. Even those Minnesotans that felt uncomfortable with the demands of the civil rights movement. So these were the years, again, where a lot of the nation was mired in what was known at the time as the urban crisis. And the Twin Cities, not just Minneapolis, but St. Paul too, were seen as sort of immune from that, exceptional. And one local leader actually went so far as to say that, call Minneapolis the last outpost of urban paradise. And this hyperbole, this extreme language, I would say, continues even today. I don't know if any of you saw this piece in the Atlantic. The city was called a miracle by a commentator in the Atlantic. So it echoes a lot of the same language. Those who've praised the Twin Cities for the arts, for the parks, the voting rates, our enthusiasm for volunteering. I think some of it with this we can ascribe to people on the coast, right? People who don't know that Minneapolis and St. Paul are different cities, actually, and to them that it's miraculous to think that such a place could exist in what they think of as flyover country, right? And of course, I'm a native daughter, right? The Twin Cities are wonderful in many ways, but this talk of miracles and paradise is dangerous, right? Because it eclipses the fault line that's ripping our community apart, that's ripping our nation apart. So it hides what I consider to be the greatest collective danger that we face. So today, by many measures, the Twin Cities have the highest racial disparities in the country. So what does that mean? It means that people of color are way more likely than white residents to struggle with poverty, to experience violence, to suffer chronic illnesses. They're way less likely to graduate from high school. And housing is at the root of a lot of these other disparities. Today, it's really a struggle for many African Americans to secure stable and affordable housing in the Twin Cities. So to believe in the miracle of Minneapolis, you have to ignore all this, right? You have to ignore racism. You have to silence the past. You have to forget deliberately. It takes work to figure out how we got here. So Mapping Prejudice, the project that I am a part of, we are leading a process of remembering. So we want people to remember this community's historic investment in white supremacy. And we want people to remember the resistance of Black leaders like Nellie Francis, Anna Arnold, Katie McWatt. Our team wants people to realize that our contemporary racial disparities are not the result of some natural order. We're doing this process of remembering by leading community members in constructing a map that illuminates how developers used racial covenants to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. So in Minneapolis, this practice started in 1910. That's the year that Henry and Leonora Scott sold a property on 35th Avenue South to a man named Nels Anderson. He was a Swedish baker. This was not an elaborate house. It was a modest house. It had a chicken coop out back. But the deed for this property included this racial restriction that's up here on the screen. And I'm going to read it. It stipulates that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. Take a deep breath there, right? The pioneer of this practice, the man who wrote that, his name is Edmund Walton. Edmund Boulevard in Minneapolis is named for him. He led the Seven Oaks Corporation, which was a real estate development company that put this same language into thousands of deeds across the country. So our preliminary research shows that this practice started around the same time in St. Paul. So there are many real estate developers who worked in both cities at the same time, and we know that they shared this language with one another as they started to use these tools to remake the city. So I'm going to read you some of the deeds that we found, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But before I do this, I want to explain why I'm doing this, because it's hard to hear this language. What we're trying to do with Mapping Prejudice is we're trying to get everybody to name race and to confront racism. To destroy this idea that we have ever had a colorblind society. And that's why I want you to hear what this language, what these covenants sound like, what the language sounds like. But I want to warn you that it's offensive. So no person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. That was from 1946, so after the Holocaust. This one is from Ramsey County. The said premises shall be occupied only of persons of the Caucasian race. This one says, no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. And this one is from the area, the blocks right next to St. Catherine's University. And it says, the parties of the second part hereby agree that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of the Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. So you can hear the way these developers are sharing language, across from Minneapolis to St. Paul. So what we have done with Mapping Prejudice is we have led community members in the work of mapping these restrictions in Hennepin County. So Kevin Erman-Solberg, who's part of our team, sitting here in the front row, he wrote computer scripts to comb through millions of property deeds from Hennepin County that to identify the documents that seem to have this kind of racist language. And our test documents were found by Penny Peterson, who another member of the team who's sitting here in the front row, who just went down to the archives and looked through all the property records to give us some examples that we could then try to mechanize this a little bit. So then Kevin uploaded these flagged deeds, the deeds that the computer identified as seeming to have this racist language, to a crowdsourcing platform. And we invited volunteers to read the deeds that were on that crowdsourcing platform and extract the information that we needed to put it on a map. Or let's be more accurate, Kevin and Maggie Mills, sitting in the front row, needed to put it on a map. So 3,000 volunteers read 177,000 historic property deeds. They gave us 14,000 hours of their labor to this project. And they found 24,000 property parcels that have racial covenants. So I want you to take a look at what this looks like. So what you're seeing here is the spread of racial covenants over time in Hennepin County. In the upper right hand, it's a little bit cut off, but you can see the year. So starting with the first racial covenant to the last racial covenant that we found. So no one has ever created a comprehensive map of this kind for any American city. This is the first map of its kind. And as we've built it in collaboration with community, we've found that it has been a powerful platform for community conversations, for policymaking, for research, and we hope going forward for action. So that's why we're here today, because we want to make you aware of this history, not as some kind of academic exercise, but because we want action to come out of it. And now we want to do the same thing in St. Paul. So, and we are so grateful for the work of the folks at the Ramsey County Deed Recorder's Office. Tara Bach is sitting here in the audience, and she was put in a lot of work to getting us these digitized deeds for Ramsey County, which we've started to work with. And Todd Euchre was incredibly supportive through this process. And we've also created a partnership with a group from St. Catherine's University that's here, again, in the front and second rows. And the St. Paul Public Library. Hold up your hands, librarians, please. Thank you. So these folks are all here today with us, and to talk about the work that we're hoping to do collectively. So this is not just about mapping prejudice, but it's about mobilizing as many community organizations over here that we can to both do the research, do the reading of the deeds, and also figure out what are we going to do with this? How are we going to communicate this to as many audiences as possible? And then what's going to come out of that work? So as you hear the rest of this presentation, I want you to think about what would this map look like over here in Ramsey County? What do you think it's going to reveal? And that's something that we can talk about, hopefully, if we have some time at the end, if I talk fast, right? So I showed you some text. I read you some text to give you a sense of what this language sounds like, what these covenants sound like, right? This map shows how widespread they were across the county. But I also want you to understand how powerful they were. I mean, that's a really critical piece of understanding these. And to fully grasp this, you have to know how they were enforced. So these racial covenants, they're contracts, right? And so they're backed up by the full power of the American judicial system. So covenants, I can defer to Valerie on this, since she teaches a class on it, actually. And please correct me if, yeah. So covenants ran with the land, which means that they could be enforced through the court system for decades after they were actually embedded into deeds. So once they were attached to a certain piece of land, something could be torn down, another thing could be built, the property could change hands multiple times, but the covenant stayed in place. It stayed enforceable. And someone who tried to break that covenant, who tried to sell that property to a person who was named in a restriction, they risked losing any money that they had accumulated in that property. Thank you. I love the nodding. So this would trigger a process that would put the property and the proceeds of the sale of the property back in the hands of the person who originally put the covenant in place in the first place. So in the case of Edmund Walton, he died in 1919, but his heirs. So for decades, right? So here's one of the painful truths about these covenants. So most white people through most of the 20th century thought they were absolutely necessary. They saw nothing wrong with these practices. We have survey data that shows this. Just one example of this. It's not quite about covenants, but in 1946, the Governor's Commission on Race did a survey of Minnesotans, and they found that 64% of Minnesotans declared they would never sell their homes to an African American, even if that person offered more money than a white buyer. So there were white people who condemned these practices. There were actually white people who fought against these practices. And there's actually a play at the History Theater this spring that tells the story of one white realtor who did that. But But most folks were just hesitant to go against these contracts because they risked for most people, their homes were their entire life savings. They were the savings of their families, and people were reluctant to go against, to risk all that money. But for Black people, it was a different story. So Black people, of course, saw that covenants were a threat to basic liberty, and they put everything on the line to challenge them. They bought houses with covenants. They moved into white neighborhoods. And this is what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 in Minneapolis. They bought this tiny white bungalow that's pictured on the upper left-hand side. And the house didn't have a covenant, but they quickly found themselves under siege by angry neighbors who decided this was a white neighborhood, and these people were certainly not welcome, not allowed to be in this neighborhood. The family, this is not just sort of some mean comments, right? They were under siege, and the family ended up having to live in the basement because people were shooting through the windows and throwing things at the house and throwing paint at the house. Their daughter, Mary, who was 5, required a police escort to get to kindergarten. The only way the house remained standing and the family remained alive is that Arthur Lee was able to call on other people he had served in the military with during World War I, his army buddies, and they formed an armed perimeter around the house because the police wouldn't do it. The police didn't see it as something they wanted to get involved with. Also, his co-workers down at the post office, they were part of a union. He was part of a union, and his union co-workers actually also were part of this protective perimeter. But the mob only grew. This was the beginning of the Great Depression. People had time on their hands. It was a hot Minnesota summer. And one person described it this way: 6,000 white people waiting to see that house burned. So as these racial boundaries hardened in American cities during the first half of the 20th century, this threat of white violence was ever present. So it illustrates one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. A lot of times people didn't bother going to court. They just called together a mob. So the Lees, of course, were not alone, right? In St. Paul here, William and Nellie Francis were harassed by neighbors after they moved into 2092 Sargent Avenue in 1924. A cross was burned on in their yard. And they refused to leave. The only reason they did leave is that William was appointed ambassador to Liberia. I'm bringing up another story just to say that to illustrate the way this tremendous resistance in the face of violence and the resistance to segregation, resistance to covenants. And I want to say that we know about this resistance because of the work of scholars of color who have created this scholarship that I am able to draw on to explain why covenants had power. So people like the Francises and the Lees asserted their right to live where they wanted, and they worked. One of their main supporters was the NAACP, which provided critical on-the-ground assistance and also legal support. And it was the NAACP that brought a series of court challenges that ended up at the United States Supreme Court in 1948. That's when the Supreme Court declared covenants to be unenforceable. So people thought, okay, that's the end of the story. Developers did not stop putting covenants in. The legal mechanism that people used to enforce them changed. So the legislature in 1953 here in Minnesota said, okay, you have to stop putting new covenants in. New covenants are illegal, but old covenants are okay. You can continue with that. It wasn't until 1962 here in Minnesota that the legislature said, okay, all covenants are illegal as part of a broader Fair Housing Act. And of course, the federal government followed suit in 1968. It's a long time, right? These things were and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Minnesota Fair Housing law was passed thanks to the efforts of St. Paul activist Katie McWatt and her compatriot Josie Johnson, who were the lead lobbyists for the legislature. So I would say that a lot of times when people tell historians, I'm going to blame historians, tell the story of covenants, they stop there. like at the moment of triumph, right? Okay, so there's this terrible wrong, but our institutions rose to the occasion and made these things illegal. And these bad deeds are a thing of the past, right? But this is not true. So we're still living with the damage that was inflicted by these covenants. I liken it to a stab wound. So when you have a stab wound, you don't just pull out the knife and assume that everything is fine, right? We've never done the healing for these wounds of white supremacy. And these wounds are not going to heal themselves. We have to do some healing together as a community. So how deep are these wounds? That's one of the things that we are trying to figure out. To answer this question, to some degree, one way to answer this question is to go back to 1910, when the first covenant was put into place in Minneapolis. And it shows us how covenants helped to change the urban landscape, right? And I'm going to talk about Minneapolis because that's where we have all of our documentation, but we know that this same story could be told about almost every city in the nation. So when the first covenant was introduced in Minneapolis in 1910, there are only 2,700 African Americans in Minneapolis. And this is a map of census demographic data from that year. And I know you cannot possibly read the numbers, even in the second row, right? But what's significant is that you can see the darker colored polygons show the presence of Black families all over the city. And you can see that it's not a large contrast in colors, right? That all the colors are pretty similar, and that means that people were spread out over the city. It wasn't like people were concentrated in one place. In 1910, in this year, the neighborhood that had the highest percentage of Black residents was near North, and that's the darker, you can see it's a slightly darker polygon, and it says 256 on it. You can't possibly read that. But even that area was only 15% African American. And what you can see here is you can see that there are African-American families living down by Lake Harriet, down by Lake Nokomis, along West River Parkway, all over the southern part of the city. So this could have continued. The city could have just let the population develop in the way that it had been doing organically. But white Minneapolitans made a different choice. They decided, they listened to a lot of the rhetoric, the fear that was rising everywhere across the country. Does this sound familiar? Where people decided that racially integrated neighborhoods were dangerous, that they were unstable. And white Minneapolitans began to mobilize against what they called race mixing. So we have lots of examples. Again, this is where the archival research is really important. We know that residents in Minneapolis along 5th Avenue South organized to remove what they called undesirable residents. We know that there was a white mob or multiple white mobs that beset the Simpson family and the Jackson family in Prospect Park. So the Minneapolis Journal published this cartoon around the same time, and they called on community leaders, and you can't see the lettering, but it's the commercial club, the real estate board, and one other group to lead the city forward. And these folks answered the call. In 1913, they adopted this ethics manual that had been published by the National Association of Real Estate Boards that declared that it was unethical for a real estate agent to introduce into a neighborhood, quote, members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. So today we call this real estate steering, and as this practice is becoming institutionalized here in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, all across the country, developers are also experimenting with these racial covenants. And in the decades that followed, these practices really changed the racial geography of cities. So this is what that looked like in Minneapolis. By 1940, after covenants had been in place for 30 years, Black people had been pushed out of all those neighborhoods in the southern part of the city, right? Those Black families down by Lake Harriet, they're all gone. Those Black families down by Lake Nokomis, they're gone. And you see this greater concentration of Black people in just a few neighborhoods. Near North Minneapolis becomes highly concentrated. You see the Old South Side around 38th and 4th becomes this circumscribed neighborhood. You see Hiawatha Avenue and what we now call Cedar Riverside, but at the time was known as Seven Corners. So by the time covenants had been in place for 30 years, race determined your place of residence in Minneapolis. So people of color were just concentrated into a couple of small neighborhoods. And here's a key point about this. These are the same people in these two maps because Minneapolis wasn't an endpoint for the Great Migration in these years. So it's the same people who are moved out of integrated neighborhoods and into very segregated neighborhoods in these years. So this story, I'm using this example from Minneapolis, but it's in no way unique to Minneapolis. This urban reshuffling, this segregation by race, it's happening everywhere. Across the nation, African Americans, in the words of the poet Langston Hughes, were hemmed in. That's the title of his poem from 1949, where he talks about Chicago, and he says, "They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free." So what we found is that once these demographic patterns get established, they're very hard to dislodge. And again, we're taking Minneapolis as an example. And what this map shows is that the neighborhoods that had the highest concentration of covenants, they're still the whitest neighborhoods today. So this map overlays our covenant data on 2010 census data to illuminate this. And I think it's important to think about the fact that these very white neighborhoods, these concentrated white neighborhoods, have never been seen as a problem. And instead, all the policy work, all the policy attention has been directed at Black neighborhoods, breaking up Black neighborhoods, right? And the solutions have just not been very effective. So there's one scholar who she sums it up this way. Basically, whatever the problem is in the American city, the answer is to move the Black people. And one of the ways that this was done was through freeway construction. So this map shows that the demographic map from 1940 and the freeway infrastructure of today overlaid on that. And so the backstory is that in the 1950s, freeways, of course, were regarded as critical to the survival of cities, to urban core, because they were what was going to make it possible for people to come from their homes and now we know totally restricted suburbs to their jobs downtown. But they were seen as having like another benefit, and that was to clear neighborhoods that planners regarded as blighted. And it's this map that shows what those neighborhoods were. So the construction of freeways was very deliberately used to clear African American neighborhoods. And of course, the story of Rondo is well known over here, right? But it's just one of it's just one of these examples. You have multiple examples of this in Minneapolis. So Seven Corners, the Old South Side was really walled off from the wealthier, whiter part of the city on the other side of the freeway. So I've said a lot about covenants, right? I'm going to say more. Sorry. Kevin's looking at his watch. He's heard this before, but here's another thing that we've come to recognize about covenants. They were critical, we think, in helping to establish segregation, which opened the door for these kind of later manifestations of white supremacy, right? But covenants were also just used to keep people of color out of the city altogether. So it's not just keeping people in certain neighborhoods, but keeping them out. When covenants were introduced in the early part of the 20th century, in some ways they continued established practices. So Minnesota Makoche only became a state after Native people were forced to cede their land to the federal government in the 1850s. The land that became Minneapolis was the historic home of the Dakota, who were exiled from Minnesota after their defeat in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. Dakota people were imprisoned, of course, in this internment camp at Fort Snelling before they were shipped out of state. And the state created a bounty system that rewarded people who murdered Dakota people who returned home, right? This is a check that the state actually wrote to someone for that. So the state seal was adopted around that same time, and it really tells this story in a lot of ways in visual terms, right? It shows a native person riding off into the west while a farmer stays put, tilling the ground in the foreground. So it illustrates this narrative of settler colonialism. So new arrivals were going to turn what had been a racially diverse borderland into an all-white territory. So covenants, in a lot of ways, are just one chapter of this larger story, right? This larger narrative of white settlement. But they were a new tool for realizing this long-standing vision of creating an all-white communities. So developers soon realized that covenants were really only worked if they kept everyone out who was not white. And in order to do that, they needed to be put in place right as neighborhoods were being platted. So this is an aerial photograph of South Minneapolis that was taken in 1938. And these are the racial covenants that we know were in place when this photograph was taken. So it gives you a sense of when these covenants were put into place. They were the first thing that developers were thinking about before the roads, certainly before the houses or the people or the sewers. And this practice ensured that as American cities expanded into this new undeveloped land, all new development was reserved for white people. So I talked about the Lee family. You know, you hear that story. I hear that story today. I hear about their dog being poisoned by neighbors, their daughter needing a police escort. It's hard for me to imagine how that story cannot elicit, anguish from people. But it didn't at the time. It didn't in the 1930s, and that's because Black people were seen as neighborhood hazards. So a disgruntled neighbor explained it this way. He said, and this was in his reaction to the Lee family, he said, when you hurt a man's pocketbook, that's something that's never forgotten. They talk about justice for the Negro. How about a little justice for the white man who has put his life savings into a home? And he called for what he thought was a logical systemic remedy. He said, if there was a legal way of keeping a Negro out of a white district and ruining the value of everybody's property for miles around, this disturbance would have never happened. So that legal remedy was covenants, right? And developers learned that these restrictions were powerful selling points. So they used them as marketing tools. They printed racial restrictions directly in promotional materials. So this is a newspaper advertisement from St. Paul here in 1913 for Frankson's Como Park edition, and it says that colored people were excluded from this new neighborhood, and the developer also promised that, quote, restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. So here's another example from the Delphine Heights edition, and this one touts these new lots as both beautiful and highly restricted. So for me, I mentioned, this is my hometown, right? This is not, again, I'm going to say it again, this is not an academic exercise. And this history, as it is for Val, it's personal for me. So even as Minneapolis and St. Paul were pushing out people who are not white, it was welcoming newcomers like my grandparents. So my grandparents were from immigrant families with roots in Sweden. They started their adult lives with no money and very little in the way of education. 2 of them were orphaned at really young ages. None of them made it past the 8th grade. And they tried all kinds of things. They actually worked all over the upper Midwest. In Wisconsin, North Dakota, they worked as farmhands, domestic servants, carpenters, lumberjacks. And then they decided to try their luck in the big city. So they were looking for opportunity. It's the classic immigrant story. And during the Great Depression, they built businesses. They got married. They saved their money. And in 1942, both sets of my grandparents bought houses. So this is a home movie. It's actually, that's not a good characterization. I was calling it a home movie. My grandfather actually paid someone to come and film the move-in for my family house because it was such a huge deal. My uncle digitized this. It's up on YouTube, 2.5 hours if you want to watch it. But it shows what a huge, I mean, you watch it, it's like they invited everyone they had ever met. They all, pulled up and dressed up. My dad is the little guy right there in the front. It shows what a huge deal this was for my family. So thanks to our map, I now know that's my grandparents' house, that black icon in the upper right-hand corner. My grandparents' house had a covenant on it. The red you see is all covenants. And my maternal grandparents lived nearby. And the blocks, they didn't have a covenant. Excuse me, but they might as well have because the blocks surrounding their houses were totally covered with covenants. So my grandparents were new arrivals, but they were regarded as white. And that meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans who had similar income levels and similar education levels. And because both my parents grew up in this neighborhood near Lake Nokomis, I grew up hearing stories and visiting my grandparents' houses. And from my parents' description, they said that this was just a wonderful place to be a kid, that their moms pushed them out of the house first thing in the morning. They spent their summers swimming at Lake Nokomis. They spent their winters skating. They walked behind Minnehaha Falls, which doesn't sound very safe to me. But the neighborhood also had really solid schools. So even though their parents had very little in the way of education, my parents both went to college. My mother went to graduate school. But all this was only for white people. So here's the covenants in their neighborhood. And they say they never questioned why their neighbors were all Swedish, Norwegian, and German. This total whiteness seemed totally natural to them, even at this moment when the number of the people of color were increasing in the city as a whole, right? And so my grandparents bought their houses just as at the moment when the United States was about to see the largest expansion of its middle class in American history. And a lot of this prosperity rested on home ownership, which of course had been deliberately encouraged by the federal government in the 1930s. The federal government started underwriting mortgages. But of course this process of supporting the housing industry, it wasn't just underwriting mortgages, it was also redlining. These programs were deliberately created to benefit people like my grandparents. And like the GI Bill, which is also touted as this universal program, it excluded people who are not white. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents bought houses in this neighborhood, part of the city where property values climbed for the rest of the 20th century. When my paternal grandfather died, my family sold his house and distributed the proceeds of the sale to all the grandchildren. And that was my portion. My portion was the part that I used as a down payment on a house in another part of South Minneapolis, where I was basically trying to replicate the childhood for my kids that my parents described. I wanted them to be able to go to the lakes. I wanted them to have solid schools. So I am fortunate, but not exceptional in this regard. There was a study last year done by the National Association of Realtors that found that 30% of first-time home buyers get this kind of help from their families to buy a home, especially for down payment. So I was not unusual in that I was able to leverage the economic security of past generations to secure the future of my children. And they are benefiting from this in all kinds of ways. Along with those benefits, I want them to know, my kids, that we all carry our history with us, that none of us stand unencumbered in this moment in 2020. So I try to make this history palpable for my kids. I want them to know that the lives that they now enjoy have been determined in so many ways by the opportunities that my grandparents had. And I want them to know that these avenues for advancement were closed to people who are not white, that covenants worked with redlining. So that's the federal program, that policy that deemed black neighborhoods too hazardous for federally underwritten mortgages. And this worked together to really depress home ownership rates for African Americans. And of course, covenants targeted anyone who is not perceived to be white using this capricious set of descriptions. But the combined impact of covenants plus redlining was particularly devastating for African Americans, who were really shut out of property ownership. So what's the result today? Today, in the Twin Cities has the highest gap between black and white homeownership rates for any major metropolitan area in the country. So 75% of white families own their own homes, and only 23% of African American families can make that same claim. That's about 20 points below the national average. Okay, so this is important. Why is this important? It's important for so many reasons. In the United States, property ownership is tied to citizenship in a lot of ways, and that's something that courts have recognized. The Supreme Court has recognized that. But most tangibly, property ownership is essential for wealth accumulation. And you can draw a straight line from these covenants, from these historic restrictions, to our contemporary racial wealth gap. It's 10 to 1 today. So that means for every dollar owned by the average white family in the United States, the average African American family has less than 1 dime. So most white people don't know that statistic. And they don't know that the racial wealth gap is actually increasing. And I find it even more alarming. People who do know some of these statistics, they acknowledge them, and then they offer them up as evidence for white supremacy, as justification for white supremacy. So Americans are very invested, white Americans especially, right, are very invested in the idea that our society is a meritocracy and that individuals are rewarded for excellence no matter what. And according to this logic, these disparities provide evidence of racial inferiority. So what we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is we're trying to help people to see structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. Racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. And reading these deeds forces folks to really grapple with this. It forces them to grapple with these ideas like, oh, the North never had segregation, or that racism is a matter of personal bias, that it's just the sentiments of people like these, of bigots, like open bigots, right? Who, like these people protested the fair housing hearings here in St. Paul in 1962 and warned about miscegenation. So we're trying to reframe this understanding. We want people to see how racist ideology has been written into the foundational documents of our community institutions, that it's actually been written into our basic contracts, right? How it undergirds our community maps, that it sorts people into privilege, in zones of privilege and dispossession. And even when people of different races live next to each other, thanks to structural racism, they have fundamentally different trajectories that are shaped by these structures that I'm talking about. So I think this history is important because it helps us to see why it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity, which has affected the health, educational opportunities, and job prospects of generations of Americans. The system was built to keep Black and brown people from owning property. It was designed to keep them out of places that were perceived to be the most desirable. And it was designed to keep them out of the places that I was taught as a child belonged to everybody. So what are we going to do? I think the time has come to make amends. And injustice is rooted in this amnesia that we're trying to alleviate. But remembering is just the first step. We have to have some action. So a shameless plug here, one action you can make is by helping us to map Ramsey County. A map that we have just, as of yesterday, we are announcing that we are ready for volunteers in Ramsey County. We have a new Zooniverse page up that you can access through our website. You can sign on, click through the Get Involved tab, and start reading these covenants and start helping us locate them on a map. To document this deliberate campaign, we've also partnered with the folks at St. Kate's who are here. They've started this Welcoming the Dear Neighbor working group, which is going to bring all kinds of students, faculty, alum, staff into this effort. And we're going to be working with the St. Paul Library. We're really excited about all the research that we're going to be doing to give meaning to this map. And some of that, I mean, that's on you, community members, right? You're the ones who are going to tell us, what are the questions that we should be asking? What do you want to know? What are we going to do with this information? So I'm heartened by some of the initiatives that I already know are coming out of this building. I'm thinking about the creation of a housing stabilization fund to keep families with children from being displaced during the school year here in St. Paul. It's going to take a lot more money, of course. I mean, we need to keep investing in housing, in schools, in neighborhoods, and people. But we also have to realize that this reparative work is going to demand more than money, right? We're going to have to seed cultural and moral capital. So I'm going to leave you with the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates. Reparations is the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. It's more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. Reparations is a national reckoning that will lead to spiritual renewal. And I want to be part of that. And I hope that you will join us in that work. Before you do anything else, I'm going to hand the podium to Liz Axe Berg, who's going to, did I say your name right? Yeah, okay. Who is going to tell you just a little bit about what's already going on at St. Kate's.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and spending your lunch hour with us, by the way. So my name is Liz Axe Berg, and I'm currently an undergraduate student at St. Catherine University. I study economics, public policy, and statistics. So I've been working on this project since the beginning of the fall last year, and it's been an awesome learning experience for me. So before I go into what we've kind of started and our goals for the project, I kind of want to give some context about why we chose the name, Welcoming the Dear Neighbor ? So actually the phrase Dear Neighbor comes from the Sisters of St. Joseph, who originally founded St. Kate's. They claim the love of neighbor without distinction is part of their unique mission, and it really emphasizes their commitment to working with dear neighbors regardless of background. And so we are really wanting to ask if Ramsey County historically has been a place that welcomes the dear neighbor, no matter what race or economic standing they come from. So as was kind of said earlier, we're collaborating with Mapping Prejudice. The only difference for us is that we are trying to add a little bit more historical context to the project, along with bringing the project to Ramsey County, because we did it now in Hennepin County. It's like, why not Ramsey County? We have the tools to do it. And so last fall, I spent a lot of my time looking at deeds in Ramsey County before they were digitized. So this was originally a very time-consuming process, I'm going to be honest. I did get a lot of help, which was great, but it was going down to the deed center, and it was physically searching through housing records and like finding deeds and then putting them into my Excel sheets. But now that the deeds are digitized, it's really going to expedite the process, and it's going to start answering questions, but also bringing a lot more questions to the table. And so my main research questions going into my project was, how are communities today being impacted, and also how racial covenants and their legacy have contributed to neighborhood narratives today. Oh, there we go. So I was able to actually find 38 covenants total in my original process. Now this is going to get a lot faster, as I said, with the digitization process. And so right here are the majority of the ones I found. On the left, that's St. Kate's, and then up there is near Maddox Park. So it's right across the street from St. Kate's, and as we put it, they are our dear neighbors, but it's showing like explicit racism right in our community. So it's kind of just a sneak peek to show that this is happening in Ramsey County, in St. Paul, in the St. Catherine University area, and so we have a long ways to go in this process. So we have a lot of work to continue for this project. In the upcoming semester, I have a lot of goals, but also it's important to keep in mind that this is a multi-year project, and there are a lot of people that are stakeholders in this project, including the original Mapping Prejudice team, people at St. Kate's, and the community itself. So we're trying to really focus on community collaboration as we do this project because it's so important to learn from the community as we do this other work. So this includes different exhibits, presentations. We're collaborating with History Theater, who has 2 productions, which were mentioned before, that are diving into some of the history of housing injustice in the Twin Cities. And we also have some pamphlets up front. So if you want to, if you're interested in seeing those productions, you definitely should. Along with this was mentioned, we're also collaborating with the St. Paul Library, where we're doing neighborhood-specific exhibits. And also, we're hoping that these types of exhibits will open conversations and make people feel like they can go to a place and learn in a safe environment. And along with this, as I said, there's a lot of other people that are on the St. Kate's team as well. This includes people from the history department who are doing archival research, and they're trying to collect stories and news from history. And this is really important in building context around the legacy of racial covenants in St. Paul. Oops. And lastly, then I have my own role in it. I'm hoping to really dive into some of the data along the modern impacts of racial covenants and housing injustice in St. Paul. I want to look at economic and housing disparities, and along with that, hopefully with all the collaboration, then it can actually build context to the data and give stories behind each data point so we can give faces to what we learn. So if you have any questions for us or like stories to share, please reach out to us after the presentation. We also have half sheets up front that have everything about our project condensed and also a contact on there so you can reach out to us in case if you have any ideas or, as was said earlier, stories for us, because we really want to make sure that we are working with people from the community. So thank you so much for your time, everybody. Have a great day.